Thank you. Thank you very much. So I could have called this Storycrafting in XR to be a little bit more concise, but I'm still not convinced of this extended reality term, but we'll try it on for size. I'll explain a little bit about my background quickly. I started working in VR a little over 25 years ago at the Human Interface Technology Lab, where Dr. Tom Furness was my advisor when I was getting my master's degree in computer science. And then I went on to Walt Disney Imagineering, where I worked in the virtual reality studio, making theme park attractions. And then Sony Development in the entertainment technology group. We built more location-based entertainment. And then spent a number of years in the traditional games industry, most recently at Activision, and then at my own company called Rabix, doing video games, theme park consulting, virtual reality, and mixed reality applications as well. And now I'm the executive producer at 2-Bit Circus, where we're building a micro amusement park in Los Angeles that's mixing physical and digital into this sort of crazy wonderland of amazement. So before talking about story crafting specifically, I want to start with the fundamentals of immersive storytelling. So in entertainment, gameplay is what we do, but story is really why we do it. And story is a core part, a fundamental part of the human experience. We've been telling stories as long as we've been able to communicate. And the different aspects of story can either be embedded or emergent in immersive storytelling. And embedded pieces are those bits that we tell, those bits of exposition and very literal storytelling. And then emergent are those things that happen as a result of what the user is doing. And storytelling itself is presenting one specific narrative. Every story has many different perspectives. There's many different ways that you can perceive that story, but storytelling is that act of telling one of those in a narrative form. Oh, jumping too far ahead. So I'll give an example here of, and I'll go back to see if I can get this to play the video. Pardon me a moment. Not going backwards. There we go. Going forwards, perhaps. There we go. So as an example, this was a game that I worked on with my friend Cyrus Lum and team. Is Cyrus around here somewhere? We built this for the Tango Lenovo Fab 2 Pro, and it was a storytelling, or is a storytelling physical hidden object puzzle game, where you're discovering the mystery of your own death in this mansion and surrounding town. So I'll use that as an example to talk about the interactive story ingredients across all immersive and interactive stories. The first is that setting, and in this case it's the mansion and this surrounding town, the different rooms that you explore. The characters are yourself and the townspeople, your family, and other people that you learn about through the course of this story. And the plot is really that sequence of events that every story has. And in this case it's the mystery of your death, uncovering that, but then also the sequence of events that you follow to uncover that. And every good story has a conflict. And in this case, you've forgotten your past, you've lost these objects. And so then for it to be an interactive or immersive story, you need agency. And so agency is in this case, is exploration. You're able to find those objects, discover them, and learn more about them. And in order to tell that story, we use both embedded and emergent components. So embedded components are common like the environments themselves. So as you go through different spaces, you learn bits about your history, about the history of the space, and the objects in that space. And in this case, we have written detailed descriptions that start to unfold. Depending on how much you investigate them, you learn more bits of the story. And then we have narration at the end of chapters in order to sort of tie things together and make sure that we don't have too many loose ends. Oh, and then I jump past audio, because we always leave audio to the last. But we shouldn't, because audio is incredibly important, right? So audio is the sound effects and sound design and music and the ambient sound that helps to put us in that space and set the mood. The emergent parts of the story, in this case, are actually fairly linear. The agency in Ghostly Mansion allows you to control the pacing. You can decide how quickly you want to go through this experience. The order of object discovery changes things a bit. and the amount that you investigate things. But really, everybody that goes through this experience hits the same main chapter points and gets to the same conclusion and solves the mystery. And so there's very limited emergence in this kind of storytelling. And we can still see a lot of great examples of linear storytelling in virtual reality. The Rose and I from Penrose Studios, Baobab's Invasion, and Henry from the Oculus Story Studio are fantastic experiences, and they're often called some of the first steps towards storytelling in virtual reality. But I'm going to argue that we have to go look back a little bit further to look at the first steps in virtual reality. Randy Pausch did his sabbatical with us at Walt Disney Imagineering and wrote this paper for SIGGRAPH in 1996 about some of the experiments that we were doing in terms of storytelling in virtual reality. Putting guests through a prototype of this experience, we learned a lot about what was working and what wasn't working. I'll just hit a couple of highlights here that participants need a backstory and goals. People get very overwhelmed in any kind of virtual reality experience, and they need to know where they're going and what they're supposed to be doing. Those goals are really important. We looked at a lot of different narrative control techniques, and we found some that worked and some didn't. Those are detailed in the paper from way back when. And we also saw the real importance of interactive sound design and using audio as cues, but also to set the mood and pacing of a story. Now, we used this to build an attraction that launched in 1998 in Disney Quest, along with some other virtual reality attractions, which are now the longest running entertainment virtual reality in the world, in Florida. And actually, that big picture there was taken about a week ago by a friend of mine. So it's still going. It's actually going to be closing this year. Disney Quest is shutting down. But what we built, and what you can experience very briefly if you rush out to Florida, in Aladdin VR is really a virtual dark ride with game elements. So dark ride is like Indiana Jones or Pirates of the Caribbean, where you're taken on a journey, but in this case there's interactivity as well. And we did have a backstory, and goals were presented through a pre-show that set up some of the settings, set up who the characters are, what the conflict is. In this case, the genie needs some help defeating Jafar. You need to collect some jewels, so you know what your goals are before you enter this experience. And we actually built a multi-user interactive branching narrative. So we have 4 people in a shared space going through an interactive branching story. And that's a lot like a choose-your-own-adventure, but in this case a little bit social. And the agency in this case allows you a little bit of pacing control, because we're in a theme park environment and we have some overarching things that push people along. But you do have some control over the pacing. And you have control over how much you engage in that social interaction. You can either spend a lot of time doing that, or you can stay focused on the main thread. And there's also a fair amount of discovery. There's different pathways you can take and discover different environments. And also, depending on how much you focus on the goals of collecting these jewels, actually affects the outcome, as whether you defeat Jafar or not. And this actually creates many different possible narratives within this structure. So different guests going through this experience will come out with different stories to tell. And that's really what I mean by story crafting. Highly emergent storytelling is story crafting. There's a lot of varying degrees of agency in immersive storytelling, but when we start to really embrace agency, we get this kind of emergent stories. And it allows users to co-create the narrative, not just to be a passive participant, but actually to be an active participant in making something. Woohoo? Yeah, all right. That's why we're here. And it really creates a personalized experience based on those things that you do and those actions you take, and that's really special, and that's what I'm going to be talking about here. But first, the origin of story crafting actually comes from Finland. It's a method to empower self-expression in children, and it's a simple 2-step process. The first is that a storyteller tells a story while the listener writes that down verbatim, word for word. They copy that story down, but then they're empowered and encouraged to rewrite that story in any way they want, change anything about it, but then retell it in any medium they want. So you can see some children here drawing pictures, they could make animations, they could hit the microphone, they could make video games, whatever they want to do in order to retell that story in their own way. So an example of story-crafted media that you can consume now, I've had the honor of working with Nani Della Pena on a couple of these projects of immersive journalism, where she's taking real audio, or real video in this case, from Syria, and then retelling that story as accurately as possible for journalism purposes, to put people in that space and build empathy and retell that story in our own way. But there are also tools. We saw some of that in the keynote this morning from Microsoft, that they've got some tools for creating mixed reality stories. Mindshow is a pretty amazing tool for very explicitly story crafting, building stories using virtual reality. You can create a story with animations and voiceover. You can send it to someone else, and they can actually edit it. They can change the characters, change the setting, and then reshare it. And this is a very literal form of story crafting, which is pretty amazing. But it doesn't have to be quite that literal, and it doesn't have to be that freeform. This is a project I'm working on with my wife, Tori, who's somewhere in the room. The lights are very bright, but she's here. That's Exclusion VR is an interactive branching educational story crafting experience about Japanese American incarceration during World War II, where people had very difficult choices to make. And we put you in a place where you have agency, both in terms of the things that you focus on will actually change the path of the story. Things that you choose to interact with will change the path that you take, as well as being forced to make some difficult choices that affect the outcome of the experience that you have, so you can share that and afterwards with other people and share how that experience differed between people. If people are interested in this kind of story crafting notion, I strongly encourage you to look into immersive theater. There's a podcast called No Proscenium, which is fantastic. There's a website on Facebook. It's Everything Immersive. There's a lot of talk about the craft of making this immersive theater. Sleep No More is a famous example, but there's tons out there where the participants actually become part of the agency of changing the story, both in terms of which actors they follow through the story, through a large space, but also as they interact with the actors, that changes the outcome of the story for themselves and the other participants around them. Escape rooms are another example of that. There's a very simple story. You've got to escape. There's puzzles to solve. But depending on what you do, and it's a very social experience, you have many different possible stories as to whether or not you escaped or not and why. I'm working at 2-Bit Circus producing these things called story rooms, which are like escape rooms but not about escaping, mixing a lot of physical and digital interactions with, in a social space to create stories that people will come out with as opposed to trying to tell them stories. An example going way back of this kind of mixing of physical digital, I worked on the Airtight garage for Metreon in San Francisco and Mediage in Tokyo that opened in 2000. We had a 32-player game in the arcade that had 4 teams of 8 players each in these different worlds. And there was this big orb in the center of 8 game stations that people were playing. And if another team destroyed your virtual orb in your citadel, then the physical orb would turn off. All of the lights would dim throughout the arcade, thunder and lightning would roll through the entire arcade, and everybody on that team where their orb had gone out would die at once, and they would scream out, and the other team would cheer, and the whole arcade would turn and go, "What just happened?" Now, the people that were involved in that had an amazing experience in the story, but everybody in the arcade was impacted by that. And that kind of competitive nature can also bring in terms of sports as a form of story crafting. The setting is the arena and the weather, the characters, the individual players, the plot is that sequence of player, the rules, the opposing teams, and the player choices. There's so many different things that they can do that actually creates countless stories. And that's really what this is about, that emergent stories are generated by story crafting. And that's an exciting thing that I think we all need to explore more. And specifically when we look at XR, common across all XR, you have control over the camera, you have control over where people go, and if you use that as a piece of agency within the experience to change the story, it becomes pretty profound. But going beyond that, there's virtual object interaction that can change the course of events, characters that you can interact with, and if you look at AR and mixed reality, we can go even further. Just the place that someone chooses to play, the space that they're in, if that's a piece of agency that we use, it can change things. In Pokemon Go and augmented reality, we use just the simple location. I choose my restaurants based on where there are Pokestops, and this changes the story of my life as well as let me give a couple. I'm being told there's no time, but can I finish up this? All right. So, and also there's with mixed reality, Microsoft has done a lot of work in terms of blending things. Fragments is a fantastic storytelling game. I've got things that I've worked on with HoloLens, using environment capture, using the feature identification of walls, ceiling, floors, and tables in order to do dynamic placement. And then when we trigger story changes based on those things in that environment, then we're really making emergent experiences in story crafting. And so that's really it. It's using that user location as a key part of agency is a special thing that we can only do in AR and mixed reality. Using environment and object recognition to trigger branches in an emergent story, whether you're in an airport or you're in a hotel, if that changes the course of the story, then we end up with really personal and more immersive experiences than we could possibly do any other way. So story crafting really generates more immersive, dynamic narratives than traditional storytelling. So if we resist the urge to just use only embedded storytelling mechanisms, we can make some amazing things together. Thank you.